So I'm super psyched today. I am a huge fan of Peter Coffey. I am a self-admitted Salesforce fanboy, guilty as charged. And when these two things kind of come together, speaking about the future, speaking about technology, speaking about, Peter has a very, very great view on not just the future, but sort of current events, how things evolve. So first of all, I'll introduce Peter. I can talk about his bona fides here, but he's an MIT guy. He's got an MBA from Pepperdine. He's been at Salesforce for 13 years. He's sort of, my experience at Salesforce, he always came and delivered in terms of a topic, any topic, really. He can really speak very intelligently to it.
Thank you, Gary.
You're very welcome, Peter. And Peter also came to our Liticast event in New York City. And, if you can imagine this, we had a room full of, a couple hundred lawyers, silent and spellbound, talking about the future of law. So thank you so much, Peter, for being with us today. I actually wish we started the camera 10 minutes ago because as we were wont to do, Peter and I just started chatting about some of the current events, and it was actually very interesting. So I'm going to rewind the tape a little bit, and we have obviously questions and such.
Sure.
But I'm going to rewind the tape and just talk about one of these things. Before I do that, thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you're joining us via YouTube Live or LinkedIn Live or via our website, our chat, thank you so much for joining. Put comments on there, put questions. You're about to go on a journey. I never quite know where we're going to go when Peter and I talk, but it's usually pretty interesting, I think. But no question too outlandish. We're going to talk about law. We're going to talk about technology. We're going to kind of travel the earth here a little bit. But we were just talking a minute ago about, the Supreme Court having their first video sessions and, how timely that is for this discussion, because, what does that really mean for law, for courtrooms, for government and I was asking Peter, what his thoughts are on, is this a new reality that kind of stays with us, or is it something that we slide back into old norms? What do you think about that, Peter? What are you seeing? What are you sensing?
Terry, we went through something of a moratorium on being with people in person after 9/11, when the airlines weren't even operating for, essentially were not operating for weeks. The parking structure at LAX was a ghost town. And then we had another period after the financial crisis in 08, 09, when there was kind of a sense of, we won't be spending money on travel now. So we've seen opportunities to reset expectations for when will you be in the room versus when will you be, online before. My observation has always been that everyone can say, yeah, it's fine to do the telemeeting, but then the team that shows up and meets with the customer over lunch has an edge, and then the team that shows up doesn't merely have lunch, but takes them out golfing has a further edge, and the arms race begins, and the escalation and counter escalation begins. The next thing you know, we're back to that kind of business as we used to say, business as usual. The question then is this one different? I think there may be some differences, because the other comment that was made after 9/11 is we didn't go back. If you can barely remember, we used to be able to check in at the gate. We used to be able to walk into the airport, meet people coming off the plane. Used to be able to do that. We didn't go back to that. We set a new level of minimum inconvenience. We created a security society where you're no longer astonished to be required to show ID and go through a metal detector just to go into an office building. It's easy not to notice that the frog got cooked slowly, as it were, and we became used to that norm. And so I think that we're going to have two things happening here. One, once people have discovered that the technology now is way better than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, trying to do a video conference with more than 2 or 3 people, it was clumsy. It was awkward. People couldn't, have any kind of give and take. And in the last 2 weeks, I've done roundtable discussions with literally 30 participants, and people later said, wow, this was more interactive than usual. Because now if the mute icon goes off, I know that someone wants to talk, and I can direct a question toward them. We have the chat window going on the side. In some ways, once you learn how to use the new medium, it's better. So there's that factor, and then there's also the factor that this is literally the fear of risking your life by getting on that airplane and so on. And that's pretty powerful. Now, you mentioned already that the Supreme Court has set precedent, as it were. by doing their first live online hearings. And so I walk into the family room, and my wife, who's currently retired, is reading up on the aspects of the law while listening to the justices doing oral arguments. I mean, this is an opportunity to be involved in and aware of process in a really interesting way. It's interesting that the case itself concerned a novel question, which is, could Booking.com get a trademark for a generic word plus the .com thing for something like hotel bookings? And
right.
Justice Sotomayor was asking questions like, well, does this create a new requirement for every company to be doing research on what's considered a generic term? It's not a new area of law, but a different application of it. But in some ways, I thought the most interesting thing about that is that Justice Clarence Thomas, who's famous for his silence on the bench, as someone said, he confines the vigor of his language to his written opinions. And yet, after a 3-year silence, he was asking questions from the bench today. And someone said, well, it's not hard for him to jump into the conversation the way he sometimes prefers not to do, because Chief Justice Roberts was directing questions to them because of the medium. And so all of a sudden, you thought you knew how to deal with that particular judge in a live courtroom setting. Well, that judge in a courtroom setting is not the same person as that judge in a teleconference setting. So an experienced attorney who might say, oh yeah, I'm the guy you want to put in front of that judge. I know this judge. I can read this judge. I know exactly what that judge is liking or not liking. You knew that judge in one setting, and maybe you're going to have to learn to know that judge in a whole new setting. So for litigators, it's going to be an opportunity to develop some new skills. You will now have access maybe to an expert witness who you previously might not have been able to get because of travel or other logistic issues. And I can say, oh, I can pull them in because the court's now going to be totally amenable to having my expert witness appear by telepresence. It creates new opportunities and creates new challenges for litigators, for researchers, for everyone in the profession.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a guest on last week, and he was mentioning Keith Mitnick, a trial attorney, very, very powerful, very good trial attorney, mentioning that body language and in person is so important, and the pageantry and the drama that sort of happens in a courtroom, like that's going to be something that's missed. And I would agree that it is important, and it does feel important, and we as a society we kind of rely on that. But I'd also agree with you that it offers up so much more possibility now that distance is not an issue. Time may not be as much of an issue, where you can really kind of pull other elements in. We see trials now that have medium come in where you're looking at video that didn't exist 50 years ago, and things like that. That it's an evolution, and I think we're going to see some of that. Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to ask you a bit about, and I get asked this a lot, particularly because Litify being a technology business in legal, and lawyers will admit that they're a step or a step and a half behind from a technology perspective. But everybody, you hear a lot about AI and predictive intelligence and what that means to particular businesses. What we often get asked is, should we invest in this? Should we? And because some groups are guilty of overinvesting. You put an entire engineering team on something 3 years ago and some type of AI thing that's going to be the latest and greatest, and then you really get zero output or zero benefit from it. But we have this fear of missing the boat. But my question to you is, how do you gauge how much you invest in something like AI, predictive intelligence, how it's going to impact these specific industries, and legal in this case? But you're sort of in a unique position where you look across a bunch of different industries and you can see what's happening. But what is that right level? Is there a right level? How do you gauge it? That's my question.
Terry, I've been in and out of the AI community since around 1985. I'll pick that date arbitrarily. It was the first time I attended a conference on the subject at UCLA. I've taught expert systems development at UCLA. I've been involved in various implementation projects in the defense sector and so on. The label of AI was an engineering and academic label for people who thought maybe we can take the mechanisms of thought and put them into software, and won't that be interesting? And it's burned through an awful lot of venture capital in a couple of decade-long cycles of hype and disappointment because people pursued it from a technology point of view. The label artificial has no positive associations, and the word intelligence has no single definition. And so the phrase artificial intelligence is in many ways inimical to getting useful things done. I've tried to invite our customers to say, I don't want to use the label AI. I want to talk about the things that it can do for me. Can it automate processes? Can it make useful predictions? Can it help me optimize my planning? Can it recognize things that a person might not notice because they weren't expecting that to happen? And if you can talk about AI not as the noun that it tries to be, but as the verbs of what it can actually do, then I think you're going to have a better strategy. At Bumblebee Foods, and I mean the people who put tuna in cans, they have a rule that no project can be named for a technology that it adopts, only for a business outcome or benefit that it achieves. And that's a really good rule, because you can say, we're not going to have an AI project here at the firm. We are going to have a case analysis project that improves our ability to estimate winnable versus non-winnable cases, or to optimize initial offers and expectations of final settlements. Those are reasonably concrete benefits that you can imagine achieving. And there are AI-derived methods. This is the term I prefer to use. Methods that have emerged from the pursuit of AI are actually very good at helping an expert human being do a better job. But that's the way to think about it, is that it's not a replacement for the person, it's a power tool for the person. And it will help them in the same way that a ignorant but amazingly detail-oriented intern might help you. They don't know squat about your business, but they're relentless in the way they look at stuff, and they notice something that it wouldn't have occurred to you to look for it because it never happens. There's an expression in medical training that you have to teach the new student: when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. Yeah, but maybe once in a while there are some stripes. If there are stripes, then maybe there is a zebra here.
Right.
And an algorithm will detect a 1 in 10,000 situation and say, hey, guess what? This is one of the weird ones. When you probably did not have brain cycles looking for that weird thing, because it hardly ever happens. And so if you can have tools that can analyze situations and say, you know what, I'm looking at this deposition, and the 5 things that are almost always there when we win, only 4 of them are there. Can that 5th one be found? That would be good. And if it's not there, should we have a conversation with the client and say, you probably want to go in with a lower initial offer here, because the odds of winning here are less than they might seem. That's the kind of thing that AI-derived methods, I think, can really do for the kind of law that I think most of the people listening to this webcast practice, and also for many other areas as well.
Right. In a sort of a broader context, what is that? So, and even sort of in this post-COVID, whatever that might be, and as we sort of come out of this, there's a lot of unknowns, and people are trying to understand what those unknowns look like. So I think the constants in what you just said are many of the cases we know. We understand sort of what they look like. Maybe you can have some behavioral components that you can start measuring and see that. But there's a lot of unknowns, I guess, that are out there that people are trying to figure out now. Like what are the new cases? Before we started the program, we were talking about how things that maybe apply to one industry now are going to apply to other industries. Yeah. What's that framework look like? What do you if you're trying to figure out what to do, like how do you even kind of suss it out? Like
the law's really good at saying, did your product or service satisfy the terms and conditions of a contract? Did you have a purchase order in which the client said, yes, by checking this box, I accept that the burden of using this product safely is on me? And yet we all know that there are doctrines like strict liability and so on, in which you say, yeah, but the vendor had superior knowledge to the client. The vendor had certain responsibilities for safety and for fitness for use and things like that. Well, think about the implications now for a workplace where I now have to anticipate and rely on my employer to have exercised certain measures for worker safety. I don't know how thoroughly they scrubbed the place down last night. I don't know how carefully they're doing contact tracing to make sure I'm not sitting next to someone who's recently had contact with another infected person. Entire disciplines are going to come up that you might have sort of seen them in manufacturing environments. We're hearing a lot right now about, for example, the circumstances in a meat packing plant where people are working elbow to elbow and trying to practice any kind of worker safety has always been a problem in that industry. I mean, we're talking about a business that counts how many amputations per year result from these working conditions. I don't think that kind of workplace safety conversation typically arises in a white collar or pink collar or gray collar, kind of office setting. And yet now in a lot of ways it will. We will be holding employers to standards of worker protection and asking questions about, if I get sick, do I have a cause of action against my employer for failing to take adequate care? What is the prudent person? What is the standard of due care? These are areas in which I think precedents may be weak and maybe taking a while to become clear over the next, I'll say over the next 1 to 3 years, maybe. We will redefine our expectations of employers' duty to their employees, of companies' duties to their customers, and so on.
Yeah, and I wonder where we land, or if we do land. We've had other guests on talking about immunities right now that are being granted to healthcare providers, for example. Sure. That almost going back to post 9/11, where there was information acts and things where basically privacy didn't matter as much because we were so concerned about terrorist activity. And, the general consensus was of, a few toes get stepped on because we're protecting the masses, then so be it.
Yep.
Similar methodology or thinking now with healthcare. But, what are those standards? What are actually going to be, do you need a certain level of protection? Is it this mask versus that mask versus this suit versus spacing? Yeah. Some of the things you mentioned, like, I guess there's a lot of unknowns there as well. And where we land is going to be very interesting to see.
Well, we've gotten very globalized over the last 2 decades when the business climate was basically benign, and when a multinational company could, think about another country as its primary growth market, and when supply chains were being run with, lean manufacturing disciplines that might have made sense when your suppliers were all within 100 miles of you, but we were trying to apply that math across the Pacific Ocean, and it turned out to be, kind of brittle. And now we've gone not from a global economy to a maybe nation's economy, and we've rediscovered, oh yeah, the United States is 50 states with each with a governor, and people are rereading their 10th Amendment to their Constitution saying, oh right, that's not a federal thing at all, that really is up to the individual states. So some of the things that I think some people had regarded as kind of quaint and on their way out, the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, of course, every lawyer can tell you how many times that's been applied to turn something into interstate commerce. And you kind of want to say, really? That's interstate commerce? Congress says it is, and the Supreme Court agrees with them, then it becomes that way. Right. And now we're rediscovering state by state. You've seen some of the pictures. Here is a beach, and here's the boundary between one county and another county. And we cross that line, and all of a sudden the beach is full, and on the other side the beach is empty because jurisdictions matter. Mm-hmm. And knowing the boundaries of a regulator's authority, a state government's authority, a federal commission's authority, what's statute, what's regulation, what's judicial precedent, it's not going to be any easier. I think we're recomplicating things that had started to sort of condense around, certain model legislations and certain, precedents that everybody followed. And you have a piece of law that was implemented based on a model code that was adopted by, 20 different states. I think we're going to see a regranularization, if you will, in a lot of areas where people say, no, we're going to do that our way. Right. And it's not going to make being a practicing lawyer any easier. Or to put it another way, the value that a good lawyer is going to be able to add with superior knowledge of how to navigate these things is, if anything, going to increase.
Yep. Yeah. The what's interesting is that a couple terms that keep sticking in my head that we've heard from our clients, from partners in the industry. Forced reckoning is one of them, specific to law, where again, from a technology standpoint, slow adopters and maybe not necessarily, embracing from behavioral or technical perspective these things. What I heard yesterday was interesting. Was I forget where I heard it, but it was this crisis is not what law wanted, but it's what it needed. And in many ways, it's going to force exactly what you're saying. Some of these conversations that need to happen and or going to happen regardless, just from an evolution standpoint. But my question is, it's actually created a really, really unprecedented amount of innovation and change. Is that a good thing? Is that a sustainable thing? Should we kind of hit the brakes, call it 6 months from now, or things are going to kind of go back to normal, whatever normal is at that point? Like,
no, they're not.
I'm an innovation guy, but I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Joe McKendrick over at ZDNet said it well. 2025 got here 60 months early. Things that would almost certainly have happened over the next 5 years now need to happen in the next 5 months or maybe even 5 weeks. And if you accelerate through the tunnel, you get through it sooner. When you're in a really bad place, you don't stop. You keep going. You get through it, and getting into a state where you can operate in a world that at any moment might need to tell everybody take 3 weeks off. I mean, the new reality is we now know how to deal with pandemics, and if you don't want to have 1 year shutdowns, you need to be prepared on a moment's notice to say, okay, everybody stay home for 2 weeks. Going to break the back of this one quickly. And this is going to call for modes of operation that we could have been thinking about developing over the last several years. In fact, I have a number of customers who said, oh yeah, after SARS, after H1N1, after Ebola, we realized we needed to have a pandemic playbook that we could pull down off the shelf and say, okay, execute pandemic plan. Mm-hmm. Of course, what some of them discovered the hard way is that having a pandemic plan is only of limited value if your suppliers didn't have one, if your customers didn't have one, if your whole ecosystem was shut down. The fact that you're doing fine is irrelevant almost. And so to some extent, companies need to think about investing in the readiness of their ecosystem and not just of themselves. And that creates some new priorities. I mean, look at a law firm. If I can do my billing, but my customers can't pay me, then it doesn't help that I was ready. You being ready and the systems around you not being ready doesn't really help. Now, and among the challenges that we find in, I'll say, document-oriented businesses, which doesn't just mean law, it means things like oil field services. It means, financial trading. There are lots of businesses that crucially depend on the flow of information to people who can take action, can approve something, can move something forward. And in a world where everybody was coming to the office, you could overlook discontinuities in your data flow because you dealt with that by walking down the hall and asking Charlie. Well, now Charlie may not be down the hall. Charlie may be in a house, 20 miles from you, or Charlie may be in the hospital. And there's an old Warren Buffett expression: when the tide goes out, you find out who was swimming naked. And in a lot of ways, the tide's gone out, and we found out whose data flows were resilient and well integrated, and whose data flows were, kind of houses of cards that could be blown over by a good, strong, puff of air. Right. And thinking about, really stepping back and saying, okay, from the moment that a potential client discovers us to the moment that we begin to discuss what we can do for that client, to the moment when we are collecting the information, to the moment when documents are being prepared, through the whole adjudication process. And then, doesn't really help if you got an award, but the person who's against whom the judgment went is unable to negotiate the payment. Well, that's kind of a sterile victory, isn't it? And so if you don't take that big picture view of the flows of information and the mileposts of action and solve the problem for the whole system, the weak link makes the whole thing just not function. And this is a way of thinking, because ultimately the job of the lawyer is not to win the case. The job of the lawyer is to secure the remedy.
Right.
And if you win the case but can't secure the remedy, then what was the point?
Right. Yeah, it was futile or sterile. I like that word as well.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned in passing there is really just about, in this new scenario, does it matter? Do offices even matter? I saw Salesforce released a report around, I guess it was coming out of Amsterdam, which we talked about briefly before, but in terms of spacing and the new sort of regulations that are required in some of these offices. But does urban geographics even matter anymore? Or is there going to be, and this is a little more of a lofty thought here, but like, will there not be such a concentration of just human beings in certain areas? Do we spread out as a people? And I'm just curious.
I don't know if you know the name of Peter Goldmark. He was generally considered to be the principal inventor of the LP record.
Okay, no, educate me.
But that was a long time ago, back when LP records were advanced technology. But in 1970, he was chartered to run a study project called the New Rural Society, and there were publications in 72, congressional testimony in 74, where he observed that for people to have an option of whether they were going to live in a city or not was really something that technology could change. That at that time, being able to get into a city and being in a center city office with access to your file cabinets and your meeting rooms and all of that, if you couldn't do that, you were really economically disadvantaged. And today we're finding almost the opposite, that the people with, I'll say, the most privilege right now are the ones who have the least need to be able to go to the office, because everything they need can be done electronically. I'm having this conversation with you from the Seattle area, for example. And the question then is, what about that whole ecosystem that grows up around that commute to the center city industry? What about the Wall Street guys whose entire business is custom tailoring during bonus season for the financial services industry? I mean, that's their Black Friday, is when the bonuses come out and everybody comes in to order their new suits. When people stop wearing suits, that's a whole economy that goes away. When people stop meeting for lunch downtown, that's a whole sector. Now, can these jobs disperse to the suburbs? Can that happen? Yes, but it doesn't happen quickly. There is a viable economy that doesn't have everybody coming to work in the center of the city, but it looks different from the one we have now, and it's going to take some time. Now, Salesforce is a particularly great example to look at this, because we've asked this question many times about what does our work setting look like. We have some pretty conspicuous real estate. We don't own these Salesforce Tower buildings. We're just the principal tenants, but it means we can put our logo on them. The tallest office building west of the Mississippi is Salesforce Tower, San Francisco. There's a new Salesforce Tower going up in Chicago. There's one with a beautiful view of Bryant Park in Manhattan. We're visible with some pretty high profile urban real estate. So what are we going to be doing with it? In every one of those towers, we've got a floor, it's called the Ohana floor, from the Hawaiian word for family, that's mainly made available for nonprofit organizations. We use that space to cultivate community. We have places where student groups or entrepreneurial startup companies can have an accelerator environment. Will there be urban space? Yes. Will it be used for the things we've used that space to do in the past? Maybe not so much. Maybe we'll repurpose that space as community spaces hosted by us rather than operational spaces occupied by us. Cities still matter. Cities matter a lot. The world can't handle the environmental footprint of everybody leaving the cities and going back out to the suburbs. If you look at the number of energy calories per food calorie of putting food on your table, the person who walks down the street to the marketplace in the middle of the city and gets a head of lettuce that came in with 1,000 heads of lettuce on a truck from the farm is using way less energy to put that food on their table than the person who drives 5 miles to the farmer's market and drives home. The energy impact, the global sustainability impact of reversing the last few decades of concentration. We hit a milestone just maybe about 10 years ago where for the first time 51% of the world's population lived in cities. That was actually a good thing for the planet, to get people out of driving around suburbs and driving 20 miles each way to work, more use of walking to work in a city. That's a really good thing. I think that there's going to be a little bit of a slowing of that momentum as people start to say, well, maybe I don't actually want to be that close to everybody, but I don't think it's going to be reversed. It might be slowed a little bit, but I think over time, the other thing that's being observed, and 60 Minutes did a great segment on this earlier this week, rural healthcare is not great. I mean, when you look at the capital involved in equipping a hospital for a COVID level world and things like, ventilators and things like antibody testing and things, start to realize, the economies of an urban hospital. Look at being able to take the Javits Center in New York and turn it into a 1,000-bed hospital.
Right.
That was an ability to demonstrate an agile response at scale that you're just not going to see if you don't have a primarily urban population and lifestyle. So there are a lot of reasons why cities are still going to be around, but we're going to be reevaluating what we do in those spaces.
I want to just stay on Salesforce for a second. And as Salesforce alum, I'm admittedly, I tend to look to it as a North Star, so to speak. But what is Salesforce doing right now? And we've had this conversation with several firm runners, managing partners, other technologists. But what is Salesforce doing right now to kind of keep connected and keep that the Ohana? You mentioned Ohana, that sense of family, that sense of connectedness.
We've gone through 3 stages. We observe to our customers that you will all pretty much go through 3 stages. There's stabilize, normalize, and accelerate. Stabilize, stay in business. Normalize, arrive at a mode where you can function through a crisis that's going to last months, not weeks. But then accelerate into what comes after that, and have a clear picture of what are going to be persistent changes and not transient phenomena here. During our first 2 weeks of March, I'll be candid, I felt like we were too close to putting the gone fishing sign on the door and talking about what we were doing to keep our own employees safe. It was setting a certain example, and I'm impressed by the fact that on the night of March 1st, it was a Sunday, I was in a hotel in Indianapolis. I got an email that said, wherever you are, get on a plane, go home. Don't worry about whether you were supposed to go on to New York the next day. Just shut down. When the word went out, protecting our people, that was number one, and that was great. What I was really happy to see in the second half of March is that we were starting to come out with some offerings for our customers under the label of Salesforce Care that were either free or very inexpensive tools to help people get through that transient stage. And then, of course, just in the last week, we've announced that we're going to take a domain that we've owned for some time, work.com, and repurpose that to a suite of tools that do things like scheduling maybe staggered teams, maybe a blue team and a gold team, so that only half of your people are in the office at any given time, contact tracing tools, the things that people will need to operate in a world that is aware of and operates with pandemic risk as just part of its environment. So we've gone through those same 3 stages. Number 1, protect our own people so that we have the resources we need to do good for other people. Take care of yourself first, or as they say in first aid, don't become another victim. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of anyone else. Well, we did
that before helping others, right?
Yeah, well, we did, and we did that for like about 2 weeks, and very quickly pivoted to now how quickly can we do things that are useful. Let me give you an example. There's been a lot of attention to the agility with which Ford and General Motors were able to take their extraordinary capability to build complicated things at scale. One of the guys at Ford said, look, there are lots of companies that can make complicated things. There are lots of companies that can make lots of things. The automobile industry is one of the few that can make complicated things in large quantity. And pivoting that capability to making the ventilators that were so critical was important. But one of my guys and a few other people at Salesforce built an application, got it through security vetting, put it up on our App Exchange, made it available to download, that manages those ventilators, that tells you where they are, what they're doing, make sure they can be routed to the best places in 4 days.
Wow.
Now, absent that capability, ventilators are just pieces of hardware sitting in a closet, or maybe in a hospital that doesn't need that many, while another one 5 miles away is in a situation of critical shortage. Adding that nervous system and brain tissue to that corpus of capability, turns it from being hardware into being life-saving. Mm-hmm. And thinking about the role of cloud services, the way that you folks at Litify have taken advantage of this environment of scalable, available services to take raw capability and turn it into value. That's really an important conversation to be having in every industry, and just being able to say, look, here's a bunch of ventilators. They're not doing a thing. Here's a bunch of ventilators plus the software layer that now can be available to anyone in the world on 4 days' notice. In fact, now it can be available to anyone in about 15 minutes notice, because that's about how long it takes to instantiate it off of the cloud. That is just not the world we were in 10 years ago, 20 years ago. That's why this pandemic is not the 1918 pandemic. This is a pandemic occurring in a massively connected planet, which is a problem, but it's also an amazingly well-resourced, problem-solving global community that has never existed before.
I hadn't thought about it like that. That's actually an interesting point. I remember actually when I was at Salesforce when Hurricane Sandy hit, and I remember a very similar approach where it was in our offices in New York. It was make sure you're okay, and then we had, and I think Mark had a meeting out in Mark Benioff had a meeting out in Vegas for all VPs, and we were going. And at that time, we were in New Jersey, where I live. We were getting gasoline to fill our generators so we can keep our houses basically going. And I was freaking out because I didn't know what to do. But then Mark was actually he sent a note to all of us saying, bring your family to Vegas. And which was, didn't have to ask my family twice to go. We went, but it was such a great indication of really kind of coalescing around your people and taking care of your people. Yep. And then from there, it was, we came back to New York, and it was, now how do we help the community? How do we help our clients? How do we pivot now in terms of our offerings? I've used that methodology or that thought even at Litify. And what's interesting is that we had a bunch of things that were in cycle to be produced. One of them was video conferencing from right within our matter management. So right within Litify, which is basically Salesforce, we were able to basically launch a video conference to a customer, to a partner, to a staff member. And that was something that we had on our roadmap, but we accelerated it.
Yes.
And since we did it, it's amazing because a bunch of publications have all reached out to us, and I've had a few conversations with some of these publications, and what they're most interested in is that type of activity, where it's, how did you react to this? How did you, what did you change? So we basically did two things. We offered a very watered down version of Litify called Litify Go, and we added Uplink, which is this ability to do video conferencing. And above and beyond everything else, things that we had really, really put a lot of effort and development into it. Those are the things that people are really interested in, and how we can help. So that's a huge.
That's exactly the right approach. When you've got a situation where when people are busy doing the routine stuff, there's always something that they'll say, well, maybe we'll get around to that next year. Mm-hmm. And the creation of an urgency and the creation of a climate for change. I have many CIOs telling me that things they've been urging for the last year or two are suddenly now front burner. Because now the climate that accepts the necessity of disruptive and inconvenient change has been provided to them, as it were, by force majeure. And the ability to have a conversation about the changes that are going to be made, as opposed to the incremental improvements that are going to be made in the business as usual. Well, that pivot's been imposed on organizations. And the approach you've just taken about, when people are in a mood where they're prepared to discover you, make it easy for them to discover you. Offer them something of high value at negligible or even zero cost, and let them discover, wow, there's value here. Thank you for helping me get through the difficult part. Now let's talk about a longer term relationship. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing mendacious or exploitive in that. It's offering value and letting people discover it, because now they have the inclination to go looking for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, Peter, and we hadn't really talked about this, but I'm curious if your thoughts on it. We had a show on Tuesday where, what's today? Wednesday. The days are bleeding together now, but yes.
Every day is now Blur's Day.
That's exactly right. So yesterday, Blur's Day, we had some folks, Utah Supreme Court justice on, as well as one of his co-chairs, because basically they're in comment period now. But the motion that they have is to really make it so to own a law firm or to be a managing partner of a law firm, you don't need to be a lawyer. To simplify it. So it's the possible ramifications of that are professional services as we think of them, meaning your taxes, your will, your financial advisor can literally all live in the same place now. And one of our clients we have out there, his thought is I want to become the Apple store for everything professional services related to the consumer. So you could really go in and get those three things done in one sitting: your will, your taxes, and your banking or investment portfolio, for example. And you do it from the same people, same business, and there's nothing nefarious about it. There's nothing, you have this organization now that can really do all these three things. So it's from a business perspective, it's created a divide, candidly, with a lot of lawyers, where they're looking at it going, well, wait a minute. Like that means, that the big 4 or 5 accounting firms can come in here and basically just throw a bunch of capital at this and take over our business. Now, some of that is, I think, driven from a protectionist standpoint, where lawyers are just going, hey, I went to school and I'm a lawyer, and this is, I have a personal level of attention to my clients that, that some accountant can't give. And maybe there's a little bit of fear around that. Some of it's a financial fear, of course. And then on the flip side, you have, progressive lawyers / business people who are looking at it going, this is phenomenal. This kind of opens up a whole new world to us. And we have to earn our keep anyway. We might as well earn it in conjunction with these other value added, things we're giving to the consumer. So just curious your thoughts on that, if you're aware of it or you're just, off the cuff, what you're thinking there.
Well, the conversation you're describing has been had so many times before. Remember when owning a seat on the New York Stock Exchange meant you could be a gatekeeper to the securities market, and you could charge people lavish commissions for the privilege of trading publicly traded stocks because they didn't have access to the trading floor and you did. And now we have not merely inexpensive, but in many cases, commission-free trading available to anyone with a smartphone or a web browser. And at the time that innovation was happening, people whose meal ticket was their ownership of that seat on the exchange felt just as threatened. And the question becomes, when there isn't a contrived scarcity of access to a market, how do you add value in that market? The thing you're talking about is essentially the argument about, well, do I want to do business with a primary care provider who's a doctor with an office, or do I want to have a relationship with an HMO which employs doctors? And the question is, what kind of value are you going to deliver, and what kind of brand are you going to cultivate? I think the role of the attorney as advocate, as counselor, is immensely valuable. What you're talking about is sort of taking the notion of a family office that used to be available only to maybe 0.1% of the population, and making that notion of a family office a much more accessible institution, about as exclusive as having a checking account. And that's not a threat to the attorney who is a diligent advocate and zealous representative of the client's interest. It's a threat to the attorney who was essentially just a toll collector, where you needed their escort to get into a courtroom and present your case. If it raises the bar for everybody, there's a book out that I often refer to called Business Secrets of the Grateful Dead. And yes, I do mean the musical group, because in many ways they created the precedents for a number of things that people in every industry are saying you need to do. Cultivate a customer community. They would not prevent people from taping concerts. They would encourage people to tape the concerts because it continually required them to raise their own bar for the next live performance. And the underground distribution of those recordings grew their fan base. If you have that leadership point of view instead of that defensive, turf war point of view, you'll do better.
Right.
The defensive turf war point of view just doesn't work anymore. Discoverability of alternatives is too good. Ability to deliver those services in a more democratic way is too good. We talked about this in the financial sector for a while, where 10 years ago there were surveys saying that millennials would just as soon have Apple or Google be their bank. And now, of course, there is an Apple payments card.
Right.
And Walmart's card is brilliant because it gives you 5% cash back if you buy on Walmart.com, only 2% in the store. So they can actually use a financial incentive to steer people into a kind of business that's much easier for them to do, and positions them to be a direct competitor with Amazon. So building yourself as a constellation of services and riding the wave, surfing the shock wave, if you will, rather than hunkering down in defense against that shock wave, is always going to be the better way to go.
Right. I was chuckling when you brought up your Grateful Dead reference, because I literally used that exact example this past week with one of our engineers who created another product we're working on, and then I was advocating, let's just put it out there, and they said, there's value against this, and there's we should do an uptick on our licensing. And I was like, no. I said, no, think about the Grateful Dead. I'm like, they put their recordings out so people would understand what it is. Yeah. And then it just, the tide lifting all boats type of scenario. And
you're a Salesforce alum. I mean, I don't know if you were there at the time when we introduced a major new set of analytic capability and indicated that we would be pricing that as a premium option. And our customers essentially said, the hell you will. Yeah. We've been tolerating your mediocre analytics for a long time, knowing that eventually you'd fix the problem. Now you fixed the problem. Of course, that's part of our existing subscription. And within 1 week, we said, oh, yeah, you're right. Of course it is.
But I know exactly what you're talking about. And then the running joke we had on the sales floor was, oh, how much is it? 300 grand, 200 grand, 100 grand. How much do you have? And then eventually it was just like, well, we'll just give it to you. Yeah. That's where it ended.
Well, the old pricing was cost plus markup, cost plus margin. And the new pricing has to be, value based. And in our configure price quotation business, price lists that maybe you once updated, quarterly or monthly or weekly, now they're going to be updated moment by moment. I was having this conversation with someone. I said, look, if a drone is flying over a construction site and it sees that the convenient delivery point for that site is obstructed by some steel that's been laid down there, and so today deliveries are going to take an extra 30 minutes to go around the back side, and someone says, well, how much for a delivery of wallboard to the construction site? You need to be able to say, today it's going to cost X. Tomorrow, when I can bring it in the easy door, it's going to be Y. How much do you want it today? And all pricing is going to become more dynamic, and all service delivery is going to start to be much more the economics of the bazaar. Remember when John Wanamaker invented the price tag, it was considered a radical notion that you would put one price on something that everybody expected to pay, because all pricing before then had been in the moment, the vendor reading the buyer and figuring out what they could sell it for.
Yeah.
The price tag has not been with us for long. The published price list is still a relatively recent idea. And so what's it worth to you right now is a question that's always going to be important, and now it becomes practical. This is one of those areas, by the way, where you were asking, what can AI do for you? AI can figure out what's a reasonable offer to make to arrive at a settlement or at a price for services or at anything else that makes for maximum value between two parties to a transaction.
Right. We've got a question I just want to ask you, and we'll probably wrap right after this question. But let me see if I can word this properly. Will we see the mindset of owners shift to a more risk mitigation focus as opposed to fixing problems when it comes to new technology? So is it really about using technology to fix things and be I guess, kind of raise the level of service, or is it really just about fixing, risk? I assume I think that's what they're asking. But what are your thoughts on that?
If less risk were always better, no one would accept payment in anything but gold coins.
That's a good way to put it.
The minute you start taking, checks or credit cards, you without even thinking about it, you've decided to accept a certain level of business risk because ultimately it lets you do more business. So risk mitigation, not so much. Risk awareness, risk pricing, much more. Now, the problem is that the business environment has been so benign for the last 10, 20 years that people have had the luxury of optimizing for ruthless efficiency and minimization of costs and have built systems that perfectly solved for the situation they knew and turned out to be miserably incapable of dealing with any change in the rules. And so there's going to be a new understanding that risk optimization is what I'll say rather than risk mitigation. I will have greater visibility into the risks I'm taking and greater readiness to price what I offer based on the risks that I'm accepting. There will always be a give and take. I mean, where do goods change ownership? Are they FOB Shanghai or are they FOB Los Angeles? Who owns the risk during the time that it's crossing an ocean? These are not new questions. These are very, very old questions. These are questions that have been with us since Lloyd's of London was a startup.
Right.
And greater visibility, greater ability to price risk, greater ability to optimize the allocation of risk based on who can accept it at the lowest cost. I mean, there are risks that are cheaper for me to mitigate than they are for you. So it's logical for me to accept them, but I'm going to price them accordingly. And I think that we're going to enjoy much greater awareness of where things are, what condition they're in, what measures are being taken. A connected world is going to be able to give us real-time information on the shipping conditions, the workplace conditions, the actions that were taken. We'll be able to audit who did what when in much crisper and precise ways. And a better informed environment lends itself to better decisions and to better accountability for the decisions that people make and the actions they take.
Yes, knowledge is power, right? I mean, that's kind of how you sum it up. I had many.
And use the critical word, not merely data. A lot of people are very excited about data right now. Data only turns into knowledge when it's filtered through insight and experience.
I like it. You know what, Peter, let's end on that comment because that was a good one. Peter, I can't thank you enough. This was really tremendous. Really appreciate you taking the time. My best to you and yours. I hope to resume our Liticast in person, despite all the benefits we get from virtual. I do love those events, and I love having you as one of our speakers. But thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it, and hope everybody remembers.
Let me just close with one thought for your audience.
Sure, please.
I remember saying this about 10 years ago. It used to be really difficult to get your IT set up, and so technical knowledge was the scarce thing in the room. And when cloud services become available, and you can pretty much take it for granted that the IT is going to work the same way you take it for granted you'll get service on your phone or power from your outlet, then your legal team becomes at least as important a gateway to your getting stuff done as your IT team used to be. So, you know, the good news is having your lawyers understand this stuff is now a surer path. AT&T once said they did an internal analysis of what their distinctive competency was, and it turned out not to be constructing and operating global networks. It was really understanding the tariff and regulatory rules of an enormous number of countries in which they did business. They said, we didn't realize that this was the thing we know better than anybody else. And so the time to be creating value by understanding complexity and helping people make informed choices has never been a greater opportunity to be of service to people than it is today. And if that's not a good definition of what the legal profession is all about, I don't know what it would be.
I think you're exactly right. And I think people are learning that, some are learning it the hard way, frankly, that they need to do that. So, Peter, again, thank you so much. Okay, be good. Thanks, everyone. Remember to follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube Live, or our website, and we'll see you at the next Liticast. Thanks again.